has repeatedly been a place where some idea will take hold, become bigger than it actually is, bigger than the city itself, and certainly into the realm of fantasy and fabrication, and it catches the imagination of people all over the world who have to come rushing out. It happened all over again with the techies.
That was author Alia Volz. I'm Jeff, and this is Storied San Francisco. Remember when pot was illegal? In this episode, Alia expounds on the story of her parents, which she wrote about in her book, Home Baked. In the mid-'70s, her mom moved to San Francisco and inherited a cannabis brownie business. After the young couple met, Alia's dad joined in on the fun. It's the story of San Francisco as it was going through a bit of a 60s hangover. Hordes of young people from all over the country still flocked here, and AIDS hadn't hit yet. Here's Alia.
So on my dad's side, I come from a multi-generational psychic artist family. And that goes back to at least my great-grandmother, who was a medium herself and considered herself married to a ghost, which is a whole nother story and a very eccentric one. Also an artist, and I think on that side, the artists go back at least another generation and maybe two.
Okay.
Oh no, three. There was a guy who was part of the Hudson School. So long line of artists of different kinds on that side of the family, and eccentrics and just weirdos. My dad grew up traveling around Europe with his artist mother, and landed in Walnut Creek in high school, spent some time at UC Berkeley, and eventually dropped out of UC Berkeley to attend the Berkeley Psychic Institute shortly before he met my mom. Okay. My mom comes from a very different sort of family, middle class, Jewish, conservative, out of the Midwest from Milwaukee. And she came out here after a breakup, just kind of following all her free-spirited friends, as people did in those days, to this mecca of experimentation and alternative lifestyles. And she just had the idea that she wanted to remake herself, and whatever was happening here, she wanted to be part of it. The two of them met on a blind date in which they exchanged psychic readings.
Yes, I love it. Can we go back just real quickly?
Yeah.
Do you happen to know, and apologies if this is in the book, I'm just forgetting.
Sure.
Do you know how your mom found out about whatever San Francisco was? Like TV shows, magazines, I don't know. Do you happen to know that?
It was very much in the ether at the time. This was 1974, 1975. Patty Hearst was on the news. I don't think that was what drew her out here, but
that'd be interesting.
But it was part of the excitement. I mean, this was
Sure.
obviously a place where wild and different things were happening, and she had become radicalized, as she puts it, at school in Milwaukee at the University of Wisconsin, first at Madison and then Milwaukee, where she was caught up in riots there. In protests against the war that turned violent when the police rioted.
Right.
So she had already kind of broken from the idea of an appropriate life,
Right.
according to her parents, and she wanted to try something different and exotic. She'd already traveled in Europe, and I think that San Francisco seemed like, to her, like the most exotic and interesting part of the country at that time. She had a former roommate who was living out here,
Right.
and invited her to move in for a while, and that got her started. She landed with very little money, as you could in those days, and her sketch pad and wicker purse,
Yes.
the classic hippie thing. And it was post hippie era,
Right.
so she didn't come for the summer of love, which I think many of us know was not a real thing anyway.
Right.
But she didn't get sucked into that. She came for whatever the post-hippie experiment was going to be.
Counterculture, is that fair to say?
Totally fair.
And that was a break from her upbringing and her maybe, would you say her parents' wishes for her, or just kind of expectations?
Sure. I mean, let's see. Her mother was a first grade teacher, very conservative, and rather abusive. They had a very troubled relationship. And her father was kind of a tough guy, and she was very, very close with her dad. He ran a tavern that was located right across from the police station in downtown Milwaukee, but it was also a mafia hangout. And he was this guy who liked to tell stories and hear stories, and so he had friends on both sides of the law. She saw him as this teddy bear tough guy, and I think she idolized the idea of a good bad guy from the beginning. And so when over time she fell into this brownie business, which we'll talk about, and became something of a good outlaw herself, it was kind of an evolution of how she understood her dad to be.
Interesting. Did she, and again, blanket apology for anything that is in the book that I just don't have a memory for.
Oh my God.
But does your mom have siblings?
She had a brother.
Okay.
He's passed away, and they did not get along.
Okay.
So he was very straight. She thought he was an insufferable square, and they were just kind of an oil and water
Got it.
sibling rivalry kind of
Right.
situation. They never patched up their relationship.
Interesting. The reason I ask is I'm just trying to kind of set this stage for what a move here like hers was.
Yeah.
Like what it meant. She obviously had a friend here, but she probably didn't have a lot of. Maybe did she have other friends who were doing that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it was a thing. People came to San Francisco when they wanted to experiment with different lifestyles. I mean, I think that was pretty common in the early 70s. Even though the whole Summer of Love thing was over, a lot of the world didn't know that.
Right.
A lot of the world didn't know that it didn't exist anyway.
Right.
And so there was still this whole there was this myth about San Francisco. I mean, and really it's been one of the qualities of this city going back to the gold rush that and who knows, maybe even before that, we have unfortunately destroyed much of that history as European colonialists, but European colonists. But it has repeatedly been a place where some idea will take hold, become bigger than it actually is, bigger than the city itself, and certainly into the realm of fantasy and fabrication, and it catches the imagination of people all over the world who have to come rushing out. It happened all over again with the techies.
Cyclones.
It's our cyclical personality. I don't know why this is who we are, but it seems to be our thing.
My theory is magnets.
Magnets.
There's underground magnets. They're all over a big one on our street where a lot of things happen. The current version or iteration of the magnets, a lot of folks that we're friends with on our block are having joint issues. So I'm going with magnets. Can we go back to that blind date, though?
Sure.
I want to hear a little more about that. That sounds amazing. And eventually, you're here. Because of that blind date.
A direct line to the person sitting in your chair.
Yes.
So, so my mom is a very intense woman and has both high and unusual standards for partners.
Okay.
She would not be with anyone who is not an artist, and had this this particular set of needs, and so she's dating and not finding people who are intense enough or she scares the crap out of them because she is so intense. And this is like a pattern throughout her life.
Okay.
So she had her best friend, my godmother Barb, would tell her repeatedly, we need to find you a magician. And she's like, sure, where do you find a magician? And then Barb, through someone she was dating, met my dad, who is this also very intense psychic artist. And he impressed her with not only his artwork, but just his gravity, his intensity, his self-seriousness, his sense of personal power. And she was looking at one of his paintings and thought, oh my God, Doug, this guy, and Meredy are going to be together. And she just felt...
Barb thought that.
Yeah, Barb
saw
had
it.
this thought.
Okay.
So she fixed them up on a blind date. And my dad, being my dad, is like, well, hey, let's exchange psychic readings so we can find out who we really are, which is just so something he would say.
And a theme throughout something that keeps happening in the book.
It's true, yeah.
Slash their lives. Yeah.
So he goes over to her house. She gives him a tarot reading, which was something that she would occasionally do on the wharf also, something she had picked up along the way. And they had an attraction to one another. The next day she went over to the warehouse in the Mission where he lived with a bunch of other artists, and he gave her an aura reading in the style that he had learned from the Berkeley Psychic Institute. Mm-hmm. My mom was pretty smitten with him at this point, but he kind of insulted her at the end of the reading. He made a comment about her weight and sent her running out the door. Another theme, yeah, in their relationship. Yeah. And but you know, he came back, she came back. There was a lot of magnetism between them, speaking of magnets. Mm-hmm. And once they got over that initial rockiness, they were just full on. Mm-hmm. The kooky psychic stuff did not end with them, and in some ways continues to this day. Okay. So they were on a very early date, in fact, when my dad said to her, I'm carrying a spirit child with me.
Right.
And this eventually is me.
It was a boy in his mind.
It was a boy in his mind.
Up until literally you were born?
Yes, yeah, psychic
right.
but imperfect.
Right. Hey, he saw something.
Surprise!
He saw something. Well, there would be an elephant in the room if we didn't talk about what your mom eventually did.
What she did for a living.
Sort of, right, yeah, her job, her hobby.
It was a job.
Her money.
So she was already doing this when my parents met.
Right.
Not long after arriving in San Francisco, at the time she was doing illustrations. She's an artist, and she was just kind of scraping by with this. But a friend of hers had a little business where she would go around to Fisherman's Wharf, which at the time it was this whole scene of craftspeople and artists. There were thousands of booths, like the people out selling jewelry today on the wharf. It's no comparison. It gives you no sense of what it used to be. There would be thousands of booths on a given Saturday, ringing several blocks, and performers, and Robin Williams doing comedy, and there were tap dancing nuns, and there was a guy who'd pull out a grand piano and play in the back of a truck, and magic acts, and it was this whole thing. And so Cherie Mueller, who called herself the Rainbow Lady, would go around with a basket of baked goods, and she was a good baker, and she'd make breads and stuff like that. Well, one of her customers had talked her into making a few cannabis brownies. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the majority of what she did, but it was a side thing, and it earned her more money, and she earned what she needed to move to Findhorn.
Okay.
Which was her goal.
Okay.
And when she decided to leave, she offered this business to my mom.
Right.
And my mom, who cannot bake at all,
Right.
I mean, she eventually learned to make wheat brownies, but she's a horrible cook.
Okay.
She was immediately more interested in the drugs than the straight baked goods.
Right.
Roped a couple of her friends in, including my godmother Barb, who came up with the recipe.
Oh, right.
And pretty soon it was all wheat brownies all the time. By the time my parents met, they weren't quite doing 10,000 brownies a month, but it was getting big.
Right. That was one of the things in the book, like the volume.
Yeah.
That you did a really good job of laying out, where I was like, wow. Yeah.
I mean, it was
The
it was
scale.
essentially a modern canna business,
Right.
but it was way before modern canna business was happening. So it was the first in San Francisco to operate at that scale that I've been able to find, and I've done quite a bit of research. I haven't been able to find one if there was one.
And a lot of the business, what I got from the book, not only word of mouth, but your mom and others who were involved, like literally getting out and walking and going to various places, like
Yeah.
doing that one-to-one sort of relationship.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that was smart about it, because of course this was completely illegal at the time, and one of the reasons I think they didn't get busted was this really smart business model that evolved out of the whole wharf situation. On the wharf, my mom didn't sell to tourists, which was the majority of the people walking around then as now. She only sold to the craftspeople and the buskers and locals who she could meet through word of mouth and have a sense that she could trust them. Right. So that pretty soon evolved to going into businesses, and she would go into boutiques and bars and restaurants and, I mean, just any kind of business really, and sell to the people on the job. She had this idea to stone the labor market.
Yes.
Which I still think is cute.
Fucking brilliant.
Right.
Yeah.
But it kept her safe in a way because she would go into an ice cream shop, for example, and have a guy there who always bought. And he would say, go see so-and-so at this boutique up the street. He's dying to meet you. And so she'd walk in, and it spread really organically like that. So eventually, my parents got together. They moved into the warehouse in the Mission where this all happened. There was a third salesperson who came out, Cheryl, and each of them developed different routes. So my mom had the Castro and the Wharf. Cheryl had Polk and Union. Doug had Noe and Haight. And in this way, they really irrigated the city with the brownies. But what would happen is they would go into these businesses and their regulars would buy large amounts and then disperse them through their own social circles. And the reason that I feel like this is what kept them safe is that almost nobody knew where the kitchen was.
Right.
And also, very few people among their customers had an idea of how big it was.
Right.
If you saw the same person every week on your street, you assumed this was a person who lived in your neighborhood coming to you on your street. You would have no idea that there were people in different neighborhoods at the same time.
And maybe that person made those brownies for me, and maybe no one else. Who knows?
Right.
Who knows?
Right.
That's great. It's a great. So was that intentional then, as a way to kind of disguise
Yes.
the illegality of
Yeah.
what they were doing?
I would say yes, but it was also organic.
Yeah.
I mean, it was organic, but it was smart and it was strategic. It evolved very naturally out of the idea of selling to craftspeople when it was small. But I think even then, my mom had an awareness that if I sell to tourists, I'm going to get busted. If I sell to strangers, I'm running the risk. And so it was smart, you know.
So can you set the stage for, you teased it a little bit about your dad's idea of what you eventually would become. Set the stage for your arrival on this scene, and obviously none of us really remembers our first few years on Earth, but maybe some of your first memories.
Sure. I mean, I feel like in talking about this, my parents just sound so ridiculous, and they are pretty wild people, but
they sound real.
To
me, it makes them real. I love it.
But I was also thinking while we were talking about this idea of San Francisco being a myth-making kind of a place, and how the myth becomes exaggerated. And in a way, I have this origin story about my own life that is like that. This is what I've been told about my life, that I was psychically predicted from the beginning, but there's a fly in the ointment. And you grow up with this idea, and it's like, well, what am I supposed to become?
Right.
So, and my parents never never tried to give me a different story. This was always the story they gave me. So my dad had the idea that this spirit child, this little boy who'd been following him since the Berkeley Psychic Institute, was going to be a healer of the world, was going to be a leader of some kind.
Okay.
Which is sort of a heavy handle. I mean,
No pressure.
What am I supposed to do with that? So he had that idea. He was going to name me Galen, when I have to say I'm glad I escaped that. There's another element of this story is that he supposedly predicted the moment of conception, which is to say that my parents had sex, and he looked at her afterwards and said, "There, now you're pregnant."
Okay.
And lo, she was.
She's corroborated this story.
Yes.
Okay.
She
So
tells
that
the same
happened.
story.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know.
Right. Let's just go with it.
This is the stuff my parents say.
Yeah.
It happens that my parents say weirder stuff than most parents.
Right.
But yes, and the dates all line up exactly right. And
Okay.
I mean, I'm a fairly serious researcher when I come at this stuff, and I try to pick it apart.
Yeah.
And there are things that I can pick apart,
Sure.
but a lot of it lines up exactly right.
Okay.
And I don't know. What can I say?
Yeah.
But yeah, so my dad was quite convinced that I was going to be a boy. My mom, he was so sure, and he'd been right about the conception.
Right.
So she was sold on it.
Okay.
So Galen I was going to be, but while she was pregnant, she read the book Dune by Frank Herbert.
Right.
It's a science fiction epic. And there's a character in it named Saint Alia of the Knife, who's a little girl who's born with the knowledge of hundreds of generations of Bene Gesserit witches.
Okay.
And she thought that was cool. So she wrote the name Alia down on a piece of paper and carried it around in her jeans, in the pocket of her jeans, never even told my dad. So when I, surprise, came out a girl, she was ready to rock.
I imagine your dad in like the corner of the room, like, what the fuck happened? What went wrong? And she's like,
Yeah.
I got this. I got this.
He was upset.
Yeah.
He was upset. He left the hospital. He went through some psychological turmoil around it
Right.
because he felt like he had been misguided by, I don't know, the universe, his
Right.
spirit guides that he believed in.
Right.
And it was kind of a smack in the face to him.
Yeah. I think he's recovered.
He's gotten over it.
Yes.
And he's now convinced that I'm a leader as a writer. So
Do you want to tell folks how they can, buy the hardback, by all means, go to the library, find it, et cetera, but also something very special is happening a week from today. Do you want to tell folks how they can find
sure.
that something special, that Easter egg?
Well, on 420, the soft cover is coming out of Home Baked, and it's we have a new design. There's a lot more bonus material, photographs. There are more interviews, a lot more artwork, because the book is also full of the artwork that my parents designed to package the brownies, which is just like some great 70s stoner art, kind of an underground comic.
Yes, and thank
of
you for
its day.
mentioning that. I was going to mention that. That was one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah, it
Getting
was-
to the beginning of it, like not only finishing a chapter, but like starting. What's the next arc going to be?
It was really,
that?
this is a digression now, but it was really fun to work with because my dad is sort of an archivist, and he saved every week. One of the artists in the collective where they lived would design new packaging for the brownies, and the art was always some sort of commentary on what was going on politically or astrologically,
Psychically,
or
yeah.
what was going on in their relationship. And my dad saved it in chronological order so that I was able to map it onto weeks. And see really clearly what they were thinking about, what they were fighting about,
Right.
what the topic was at the time. So it was a really fun tool. And then I got to, of course, use some of these designs as chapter headers throughout the book, and it was a lot of fun to work with. But anyway, so there's more of that in the paperback. The paperback comes out on 4/20, and you can get it wherever you buy books, but hopefully you buy your books from a local independent bookstore.
Absolutely. We're not far from one of my favorites, Green Apple, which is 2 blocks from here.
Yep.
2
And
blocks.
Green Apple has signed copies always.
Yes.
That's like, they're right around the corner, so I pop over and sign them all the time.
That was Alia Volz. On the next episode of Storied San Francisco, Alia will tell us more about her own life. Please join us this Thursday for part 2.
Music for the podcast was produced, performed, and curated by Otis MacDonald. Original photography is by Michelle Kilfeather. Aaron Lim of Bitch Talk Podcast is our contributing producer. The show is produced and hosted by me, Jeff Hunt. Now in our 4th season, we have nearly 150 episodes available on our website, storiedsf.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you can, subscribe, rate, and review our show so that we can reach even more folks. And if you'd like to drop us an old-fashioned email, we'd love it. The address is storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay strong, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.
This podcast is a proud member of the BFF.FM podcast network. Learn more at podcasts.bff.fm.
BFF.FM, best frequencies forever.